this lecture, we're going to take a look at injuries in the context of sport. We'll both look at the psychology of coping with injuries, as well as maybe some surprising information about how psychology can actually contribute to injuries. One thing that we know is that injuries are inevitable in sports. They are just completely unavoidable. In fact, it's pretty rare you'll see an athlete talk about how lucky they are to be injury-free for a season or even for the most part of a career. Injuries are just part of the picture of sports, so they're part of the whole fabric of what sports are about. There are approximately 1.5 million injuries just in high school sports every year in the United States. So if you multiply that out then beyond youth sports, college sports, professional sports, recreational sports, it's an incredibly huge number that this is why I say it's just an inevitable part of sports. Some of the most common injuries are typically orthopedic, things that involve the bones, broken bones, joints, muscles and tendons, torn ligaments, sprained ankles. These sorts of things are probably the more common injuries we'll see in sports. But there's other kinds of injuries, for example, things like injuries to the brain or concussions, which we'll talk about elsewhere in the course, or to the nervous system. Injuries to the eye or to the spinal cord can take place. There's a whole variety of injuries that could take place within sport. We also know that the rate of injury and the type of injury that's likely to be occurred really varies quite a bit by sport. So we know, for example, in contact sports, we're more likely to get things like broken bones or concussions versus non-contact sports, say like tennis or golf, where those may be unlikely to occur. We also know that injury rates can vary by sport because sports differ by typical ages. So, for example, we may see overuse injuries in very young gymnasts who are training for hours and hours on young, growing bones. That'd be an example of another type of injury that varies by particular sport, depending on the context, including things like the age of the participant. Injuries have an impact. They are not just a physical event, but they are a psychological event as well. Now, most injuries, of course, are pretty minor and result in only temporary disruption of sport participation at worst. Most with some rest and some simple treatments like maybe ice or anti-inflammatory medicines, they might be able to return really quickly. And of course, lots of athletes simply what we call play with minor injuries. If you look at a lot of really physical contact sports like soccer or football, by the end of a competitive season, almost everybody on the field is dealing with something that we might refer to as an ache and a pain, some sort of a minor injury that could benefit from some rest, but they're able to just keep going. Some injuries are more significant. They're what we might call major injuries, and they can end seasons or even end careers, and we'll talk about that in a different lecture. Some can actually be catastrophic, and it's even possible for some injuries within the sport context to lead to death or even lasting disability. Spinal cord injuries, for example, could lead to permanent paralysis. And so there is the risk within sport of really catastrophic, very, very serious injuries. And when we think about injuries in this course, we're going to talk primarily about the psychological response to injury. And as I mentioned previously, an injury is a psychological event as much as a physical one. And there's a wide variety of psychological reactions that could occur. And these include cognitive or thinking kinds of changes. So athletes may have to reevaluate their goals, maybe adjust their expectations for what's possible. Sometimes an athlete's goal may go from being an All-American to perhaps their new goal is just being back on the field before the season ends. They may be reevaluating their self-image. Who am I if I'm not an athlete, if I'm not a starter on this team? Am I still a leader? So there can be lots of sort of questions go through their mind about, well, who am I and what does this mean for me that I've experienced this injury? Of course, that's going to vary quite a bit on the extent of the injury. There can be emotional reactions. Athletes will often have lots of fears about the uncertainty of the future. Before an injury comes along, for many athletes, the future feels very certain. They can know where they're going. They can predict their outcomes. They're very secure and comfortable with what they see ahead in the future. But an injury kind of upsets that apple cart and changes everything. Many athletes experience fears of re-injury, especially with more major injuries, and so that can be a real concern. Imagine if you were to blow out an ACL, for example, and you were to then go back into rejoin your sport, you're probably gonna have a lot of injuries about, well, what if that knee isn't fully healed? What about my other knee? What if this were to happen again? And fears of that re-injury occurring. Frustration, depression, possibly, lots of possible emotional reactions. And then, of course, there's lots of behavioral reactions. Many athletes are going to do something in response to the injury. They may use or withdraw from support. They may engage or not engage in the rehabilitation process. Some may engage in malingering, which is faking bad, basically making the injury worse than it is for some motivation. The picture on this slide here, you see, I'm sorry for the Dallas Cowboys fans who may be in the class, but you may recall well when Tony Romo went down a preseason with a pretty serious injury to his back. It required him to reevaluate everything. And the other picture here is a famous press conference where he came out and said, listen, I just accept that I am no longer the starting quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys, the dream of my life. And my job now is different. My job is to support the new quarterback and to support the team and do everything I can to help us be successful. That's an example of if you watch that press conference or remember that, that was an example of cognitive, emotional, and behavioral responses to a pretty serious injury. Now, the nature of the psychological response, how serious it is, how profound it is, depends on a lot of different factors. There are personal factors like the severity of the injury. How bad is it? What is the likely prognosis or outcome that we can predict? Are there complications for rehabilitation? Was the surgery successful? Does the surgery have to be redone if a surgery is involved? What about the athlete's personality? Some people are patient, some people are impatient, as one example of personality that comes into play with injuries. How much social support do they have, especially social support that is not directly involved with the sport participation? And what about their history? So two athletes have the exact same injury, may have very different responses. If the injury is a first injury for one athlete and another injury, this is the fourth or fifth time they've dealt with the exact same injury, you may see a different kind of psychological response depending on that history. There's also a variety of situational factors that come into play. Things like the timing of the injury. Is this in the preseason? Is it at the start or end of a career? Is it just before playoffs? Where does the timing of the injury come into play? Some injuries are a little more cruel, I guess we might say, with their timing. Many Oklahoma folks who are Oklahoma City Thunder fans recall really well a few years ago when the Thunder were one of the best teams in the NBA, and I think it was just a game or two before the playoffs. Russell Westbrook was taken out of the playoffs with a knee injury and just totally changed everything, and that was terrible timing for Russell Westbrook and for that team. What is the role of the coach is another situational factor. How much support does the coach provide? What kind of feedback can the coach use to continue to motivate and encourage the athlete through rehabilitation? Another situational factor is, does the athlete actually have access to good rehabilitation and treatment? One of the things you often see in professional athletes is if they have a serious injury, they immediately fly across the country to go see the world's expert in that particular injury. Well, that's a tiny slice of athletes have access to that level of expertise for rehabilitation and treatment, and not everybody has access to that, so that may play a role as well. When we look at the rehabilitation process, there's also psychological aspects to that we can think of. In general, we think of the injury experience of having three broad phases. First, there is the initial injury and the shock and adjustment that comes into play in the minutes, hours, or perhaps days following the initial injury. Then there's the rehabilitation process, and that can last from days to months or even a year or more. And then once that is complete, there is the return to sport process. There are different psychological challenges at each level of this phase of the injury process. We know that for rehabilitation to be successful, treatment adherence is super important, and that involves a lot of psychological factors. The athlete has to maintain a sense of commitment to participating in the rehabilitation, doing what is necessary. Rehabilitation for many sports injuries, by the way, is painful. It's not easy. It takes a tremendous amount of pain. If you've ever had a major knee surgery or had somebody gone through that or something like that, you recognize it is incredibly excruciating painful at times to do what's necessary to rehab fully from that. It requires a lot of commitment for somebody to put themselves through that. Are they willing to put forth the effort? Are they willing to follow advice and do what doctors are saying needs to be done? and then they need to be able to return to training and competition when the time has come. Many of you are familiar with in the NBA in the last few years. There have been some players, I won't name them to call them out, but there have been some players that people have been puzzled that the doctors are saying that they're fine to play, but they are saying I'm not fine to play and they won't return. Well, that's a psychological issue of, what is that about? Sometimes psychological intervention is actually necessary to help people cope with injuries and to return to sport. So we may see clinical issues arrive like depression, clinical levels of anxiety, or even post-traumatic stress disorder related to the experience of the injury. And some clinical interventions, psychological treatments may be necessary to try to help athletes cope with those issues and return to sport, or cope with not being able to return to sport. We also know that a number of psychological skills that we've talked about in this class can be really helpful during the rehabilitation and return to sport process. Things like relaxation skills to help with patience, imagery, cognitive restructuring to not catastrophize things that are taking place. One of the experiences I had once as a sports psychologist is I was working with a member of a diving team at a major university, and he had to be out because of an injury for about 2 months. And during that time, we had him practice diving every day through imagery and visualization. And what he told us is that when he got back onto the diving platform the first time, it felt like he had been there every day because he was so invested in that imagery and visualization practice that it was almost as if he had not missed a single day. So sometimes imagery can be used to help maintain skills and maintain motivation, even while the athlete can't physically engage in the sport process. Now, here's an interesting thing to talk about. Can psychological factors actually cause injury? Now, I think it's fair to say that most sports injuries are entirely random events that are caused mostly by random factors. If you think about, for example, somebody in a jumping sport like volleyball or basketball who lands on a teammate or an opponent's foot after they jump in the air and they come down and they roll their ankle. Well, that's a completely random event that couldn't be predicted or probably entirely prevented. However, research has consistently found that life stress is a significant risk factor for predicting sports injury. Athletes who have higher levels of life stress in the previous months of their life are at greater risk of getting injured from what seem like completely random events. And that's a pretty interesting possibility, and it's been consistently found. So how could that be? How could a history of stressors contribute to injury? And keeping in mind, it's a fairly small contribution, so it's not saying these psychological factors are the cause of all injuries, or if you could remove stress, nobody would get injured. We're just basically saying that it increases the risk a little bit, and it's been consistently found for creating injuries. Well, there's a number of mechanisms that have been proposed and many supported by research of how life stress could actually contribute to a sports injury. One thing we know is that life stress leads to an increase in muscle tension. And if you take a tense muscle into the sport environment and put it under load, that may create a tipping point whereby things like pulled muscles or strained joints could occur because that muscle was not more relaxed before going into that experience. We also know that stress disrupts sleep, and disrupts sleep can cause athletes to not be fully alert, and particularly contact injuries could occur because an athlete simply wasn't as fully alert as they could be of all of their surroundings and environment and weren't able to perhaps avoid collisions or brace themselves before collisions. A similar process is that under stress, we know that our vision actually changes in what we call peripheral narrowing. This is a consequence of the stress response of the body that helps us as an organism when we're under stress sort of narrow in on what's important. If you're facing a predator, for example, you want to really pay attention to that predator and don't worry so much about what's going on over here. You want to pay attention to that predator. So when under stress, we know that even for us as humans, our vision narrows a little bit. Our peripheral vision isn't quite so good. Well, think about things like a contact injury in soccer or football or some other contact sport. Sometimes you get injured because you didn't see what was coming. You get what we call blindsided by a hit. And a fraction of those hits may have been avoided if peripheral vision wasn't narrowed. We had better vision and we could avoid or brace ourselves before that contact came into be that caused the injury. So that's a really provocative possibility. So taken together, these different aspects of the stress response do create a risk that slightly, marginally does increase our risk for injury, and that's pretty fascinating, I think. So a few key take-home points from this lecture. First, that injuries are a part of sport. Everybody in sport is going to experience or deal with injuries sooner or later, and they can be significant psychological events that require coping and adjustment. A variety of personal and situational factors influence the way athletes respond with cognitive, emotional, and behavioral responses. Psychological skills interventions can sometimes be necessary during rehabilitation and return to play to help athletes fully recover their skills and abilities to perform following an injury. And we also know that psychological factors can actually increase the risk of injury.